Hey, we'll look at CCA security for public key encryption schemes. And I'll start with three questions that I have, and we'll also just immediately answer. So the first one is, do we need CCA security for public key encryption schemes anyway? And the answer is yes. So there's, for example, the Bleichenbacher attack against the RSA encryption scheme, if it uses like this PKCS 1.5 padding. So this attack really brought CCA security to the minds of security people because it was a CCA attack against RSA, which is not CCA secure. And he showed that you can capture a ciphertext, then send slightly changed versions of the ciphertext to the server, and gain information about the content of the original ciphertext by checking whether or not these small changes result in a decryption error. And the decryption error for this RSA scheme happened if the padding was kind of not valid anymore. So all this should remind you of the stuff that we've talked about before for symmetric encryption, where actually most CCA attacks look like that. And all of this doesn't really change for public key encryption. It's the same as for symmetric encryption. So if we have active attackers, so attackers that can basically send ciphertext to you, and you would just willingly decrypt them and kind of leak some information about the decryption result to the outside, back to the attacker, like even if it's just a decryption error, then in these scenarios you need a CCA secure encryption scheme to make sure that these don't reveal your old messages. Question number 2. Are the public key schemes that we've seen, are some of them maybe already CCA secure? And there the answer is no for every single one. So for the scheme in the lecture, for the RSA encryption scheme from the tutorial, and also for the Allgemein encryption scheme from the tutorial, they're all completely CCA insecure. And that's because they all have this like one-time pad part in them. And you can easily manipulate this one-time pad part to change the message that's encrypted in there, ask a decryption query, get the changed message, and just change the message back. So no, none of the encryption schemes that we had is CCA secure. Basically, they're the same attacks that we also had for private key encryption. So now let's get to the interesting question. What's the problem with CCA security and public key encryption? Because we have solved this before, right? We had private key encryption that was just CPA secure, and we were able to upgrade it to CCA secure private key encryption by basically adding a MAC to all ciphertexts. So that was our technique to basically disable the decryption oracle for the adversary, because the adversary wasn't able to create these MAC tags himself. So he wasn't actually able to submit any ciphertext to this decryption oracle, except for the ones that we have created with our secret key. And we were able to generate a valid MAC for that. Those he can submit, but those are not really helpful to him because you already know what the result is. So there our technique was just, okay, authenticate every single ciphertext. Nobody can create ciphertext except for the two people who have the key anyway, and they can decrypt anyway. And then that's it. That was the solution there. But now, if you really think about it, this approach doesn't cut it here at all. Because we can't just say, okay, only people with the secret key can create ciphertexts. Because inherently in public key encryption, everyone can create ciphertexts. Just use the public key and run the encryption algorithm. So now we can't apply our original idea anymore of just macking the ciphertexts. Because if you just publish the MAC key, then like the security of the MAC is just gone. So that doesn't really make sense. So then maybe you could think, okay, we can't use MACs, obviously, because they're like a symmetric thing, and we're in a public key world. So maybe use the public key equivalent of MACs. But that doesn't work at all either, right? Because let's say I wanted to now authenticate the ciphertext by signing them. Everyone should still be able to create ciphertexts. So to make this work, I guess the only way would be to actually publish the secret key for the signature scheme. And at that point, like the security of the signature scheme is just gone. So we need to come up with something new. We can't just reuse this old idea of authentication of ciphertexts. And instead we need to make it so that everyone can create valid ciphertexts. But if I give you a ciphertext, then you cannot touch it at all. And I want to show you one way how to do this, and that's the Fujisaki-Okamoto transform. I won't go into too many details there. It's just to give you a rough intuition of how this is possible at all. So what does a CCA secure encryption scheme look like anyway? Okay, so let's do this. We start with two random oracles, H1 and H2. Remember that we had this trick where we could just take one random oracle H and just make it to two random oracles, H1 and H2, by basically just prefixing the input. So having two random oracles is actually not very much different from having one random oracle. And then we take some public key encryption scheme that's CPA-secure, and now we upgrade it using Fujisaki-Okamoto. The key generation stays the same, but now our ciphertext will look very much different. So to encrypt something, you choose a random R, and then you have two parts of the ciphertext, kind of as usual, as we had for public key as well. One part that carries the message, and another part that's the decryption hint, essentially. So the part that carries the message is just the message XORed with the hash value of R, of the random value that we chose here. So that's kind of a one-time pet kind of deal. And now to make this decryptable at all, we basically add an encryption of this value R to the ciphertext, and this will be our C1. So up until now, this is kind of standard. This is basically hybrid encryption with just a random oracle thrown into this. Now the big trick of Fujisaki-Okamoto is that as randomness for this encryption of R, we derive this randomness as the hash of the random value R and the message M. Now decryption starts as you would think. We decrypt the message by XORing it with the hash of R, and we get this R by decrypting C1. That's the decryption hint, that kind of makes sense. But then before we actually output M, we first check whether this C1 is actually formed exactly using the randomness of the hash 1 of R and M. So we basically check that C1 is correctly formed with respect to R and M. And if it is correctly formed, then we output the message. Then we say it's just a valid ciphertext. And otherwise we output the error symbol. Okay, so base scheme basically understood. We have this XOR part, and then we have a decryption hint, and the fun thing is that this decryption hint is generated using specific randomness that is also checked while decrypting. So now to get an intuition for this, let's suppose we have an adversary that wants to take this ciphertext. Let's say this is a challenge ciphertext, and he wants to kind of tweak it a little bit. So change some parts of it to be able to query the decryption oracle for it. So let's say he wants to change something about C2, which should be your first instinct, because that's basically how we broke all of our CPA-secure encryption schemes in a CCA setting. We just XORed something to the C2 and then asked the decryption oracle for the decryption result of that, which would give us M XOR X. So let's play through this. What happens if we change C2? Well, the decryption of C1 still succeeds, still gives us the same R, we haven't touched that. And then as a message, we now get M XOR X. But now, look what's happening here. If now the decryptor does this check here, then he doesn't do it with H1 of R and M, with the original values that were used when creating C1, but instead he uses the hash value of R and M XOR X. So now if we haven't touched C1 at all, then this equality here won't hold anymore, because now we just gave the encryption algorithm completely different randomness. Remember that H1 is a random oracle. So if we give it a different input, we would just get a different random string, completely independent of the first one. And so if we got the same C1, that would kind of be a bad sign for this encryption scheme, because usually if I invoke the encryption algorithm twice with independent randomness, I should definitely get different ciphertexts with like overwhelming probability. So now you may say this was kind of stupid. The adversary changed C2 and he left C1 untouched. So what if he tries to now adapt C1 to be something different? So we may try now to make the decryption succeed by also changing C1. But there's a single value for C1 that would be accepted, and that is... But he cannot really create this encryption because he doesn't know the R. Okay, because the only information he gets about R is in the ciphertext. So, but if it's a secure encryption, then he shouldn't be able to get R. or he just randomly queries it to the random oracle and notices that this value fits with C2, but that's very improbable because we chose R to be an n-bit string, and so the probability of the adversary just randomly choosing that is pretty low. So to summarize, if the adversary tries to change C2, then decryption won't work anymore. If it then also tries to find C1 such that decryption works again, then in order to do this, it would have to find R and query that to the random oracle. But that should be hard because it only sees R essentially in the encryption for the ciphertext C1. So basically, as soon as you try to change C2 a little bit, you won't be able to find a fitting C1 anymore. Unless, and this is kind of the trick of all of this, unless you are the person who is currently creating the ciphertext. Because if you have chosen this R, then you obviously know R, and then you can compute these in any order you like. But if you only get to see the ciphertext, the result of that, you don't get to see the R anymore, except if you have the secret key, of course. And then it will be hard to kind of tweak this ciphertext at all. So let's argue about this construction on a somewhat more high level. My claim is that essentially the decryption oracle in the Fujisaki-Okamoto transformed encryption scheme has no value to the adversary because whenever he queries it, he already knows what the result will be. Meaning that there's no new information that he gets from the decryption oracle. Why is this? So let's say the adversary submits a decryption query for C1 and C2. Then within the ciphertext C1, there's some R. And then there are two cases. Either the adversary has at some point queried this R to the random oracle. If he has done this, then he can do the decryption basically himself. Because in this case, he knows the R because he has queried it to the random oracle. He definitely has to know it. In that case, he can just compute M that is hidden in C2, and then also just compute this randomness that he should have used in the encryption, and then just check that this C1 is actually formed this way. So basically, if it's not formed this way for the R and M that he chose, then this decryption oracle will also just reject the ciphertext. And if it is formed the way, then the decryption oracle will also just output M by XORing C2 with H2 of R. And that's something that the adversary could also do himself because he knows R, so he can just compute H2 of R also by querying it to the random oracle. So to summarize, if the adversary knows R, then he can do the C1 check himself, and he also can do the decryption of C2 himself. And hence he already knows the result that the decryption oracle will output. Case 2, this R that is contained in the C1 is an R that the adversary has never queried to its random oracle, which the adversary can pretty much also just check by checking all of the R's and all of the M's that it has ever seen in this game, and just computing the hashes of all of those, or asking the random oracle for hashes of all of those, and then kind of checking whether the C1 that he came up with, like however, is actually a well-formed ciphertext with respect to any of the R's that he has queried before. So if the R hidden in C1 is something that he has never queried, then also this ciphertext check here will pretty much always just fail. Because in that case, H1 of R and M is just uniformly random from the view of the adversary. So the C1 that he came up with is independent of this H1 value. And so the chances that the encryption algorithm actually outputs this specific C1 for a uniformly random randomness input is just negligible. Basically, if this was likely that you can kind of guess the ciphertext that will be the output of the encryption algorithm, then this is not a good encryption algorithm. Because an encryption algorithm should have many possible ciphertexts for every message. So case 1, adversary has queried R, then he already can tell what the decryption result will be. Case 2, adversary does not know R, then the decryption oracle will also just output the error symbol with like overwhelming probability. So this concludes that the decryption oracle actually doesn't help the adversary because whenever he queries it, basically already knows what the answer will be. So that might as well not exist at all. And then we're back kind of to CPA-security of this construction here. And that is also kind of easy to see. If for the challenge ciphertext, the adversary at some point finds R, then he has won basically, because he can just unblind the message. But that should be difficult, because in that case he would have broken the security of the encryption scheme, because he was able to find R, which is the thing that was hidden in the encryption. So in that case he breaks the original encryption scheme. And if he doesn't find R, so if he never queries R to any random oracles, then the C2 part here is just uniformly random and independent of the message bit B. So C2 may be M0 XOR H2 of R, or M1 XOR H2 of R, no clue. Okay, this is the rough idea of Fujisaki-Okamoto. The actual proofs for this are a bit more complicated, but I just wanted to give you an intuition of how this works, and basically why it's possible at all to have CCA secure public key encryption schemes, and what kinds of techniques may help with this. And here it's that we have like two ciphertexts, and like messing with either of them will basically make the decryption oracle result completely useless. Okay, thanks for watching this, and see you.